Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first ever episode of the Security Table podcast series with Olympix. Today, we're going to be talking about why audits aren't enough. This is going to be part one of a three-part series. Episode one, part one, is going to be inherent limitations of audits. So the idea being here that audits alone do not guarantee security. They inspect what's visible, but not what's exploitable. So we're going to dive into a little bit of what the strengths are of traditional audits, what the limitations are of traditional audits, and how you can be thinking about more of a comprehensive layered security approach. In future episode parts of this episode, we'll dive into how you can actually mitigate the risks and kind of some of the other things that you can employ. But yeah, today focusing on the inherent limitations of audits. So let's dive right into it and talk about audits and what they are great at. Anish, yeah, walk us through what is good about the traditional external third-party audit.
Well, the good thing about audits are that these auditors have seen a lot of hacks and they've looked at a lot of code. So they're really good at finding known problems. They know about hacks that have happened before, and they're very good at translating these patterns across different contracts and trying to find these same kind of problems that happen in a lot of places. They're also really good at looking at the overall picture at what the contracts are doing. So, for example, if you give them a text, they're very good at looking at the larger picture view of what this text might be trying to do, and then try and see if the assumptions in the code make sense behind that. What they're also really good at is for marketing.
And Hani, I know that one of the key reasons that a lot of teams are getting external audits is beyond security. So walk us through
Mhm.
how you see that. Like why else are teams getting these? What important role do they play in kind of marketing or go to market?
Great. Great question, Sarah. So I'd say two parts. So one is stamp of approval. When it comes to security, outsourcing risk is such a hack. Being able to say someone else looked at that and thus I'm not the only person who looked at it. And thus it is secure. Someone who's viewed thousands of projects, millions of lines of code has also said my code is good. Stamp of approval. I made the changes. Being able to outsource risk is something we all as founders own and do continuously. We do it with our board insurance. We do it by hiring other employees. There's so many ways that we do it. Outsourcing what previously was ours. So outsourcing risk is one piece of it, and getting that third party stamp of approval. And going on to that third party to elaborate on that third party stamp of approval, that creates great marketing material, right? Like I said, when someone else who is a trusted party who has audited thousands of projects, millions of lines of code says this is good, you're signaling to every external retail investor, partner, I am secure, I take care of my security, and someone else has validated that. And that allows you to have like this breath of fresh air. So yeah, marketing and then the stamp of approval enables that and also kind of gives this breath of fresh air to the founders that like someone else has validated that we have done this right.
Let's dive into some of the limitations, though. Of course, those are the fantastic things that we're getting out of an external audit. An external audit is an absolutely critical and necessary step in an overall layered security approach. But of course, there are some limitations as well. And I'll start off with a couple of those limitations. So when you get an external audit, that auditor doesn't work for you. They haven't spent many hours, architecting and writing the code that's going to be audited. And so the audit happens and it has limited time, it has limited scope. If that auditor comes in and they don't understand your code and your protocol and all that sort of stuff at the beginning, which they won't, it means that they'll have to spend some of that very valuable time of theirs building an understanding of your code, which of course you need them to do, but it's eating into that time. So there's sort of like a double-edged sword here where a whole bunch of the time that you're paying for from an external audit is going to be spent with them just getting to know your code so that they can even begin to try to find issues that might come up in that code. It would be great if there was some way that, you could skip that and instead the entire audit time would be spent just finding vulnerabilities, but that's just an inherent reality or limitation of of the audit, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the just overall limitation of time. It's usually something like a couple of weeks, a couple of months, depending on how big the code base is that's going to be audited, but it is limited. The time is limited, and some chunk of that very valuable time is going to be spent getting to understand your code, which means less of the time is going to be spent finding vulnerabilities in the code, but that is just the nature of the beast. And Anish, yeah, talk to us about some of the other limitations that you see from external third-party audits.
No, yeah, great points, right? And I'll just build off on that. I think because these auditors just have a limited amount of time on their hands, it leads to a lot of problems. The first one being that they're humans, right? So they're humans with a limited pair of eyes looking at some contracts for a limited period of time. What this means is that they make errors. A lot of times, what happens is there are simple vulnerabilities that pass through these contracts just because they didn't look at a function the right way, right? Like some really simple vulnerabilities, including, for example, someone not including the non-reentry modifier somewhere that slips through. It's just because these people who are looking at these contracts are very human, and they just unfortunately cannot detect the same vulnerabilities all the time. The other point is that sometimes these issues are really complicated. So, for example, if there's a really complicated economic vulnerability that only happens when you do these four functions in the right way, and is only triggered when the environment is a certain way, when they have a certain amount of money in in the contracts balance, etc. And only then is this hack possible. It's just impossible for a human to think that deeply all the time, and this is how these vulnerabilities pass through. Um, Basically a lot of these attack vectors which we have seen being employed in a lot of recent hacks, actually, like Cork, for example, where you saw this really complicated math economic vulnerability that took place, and that led to this re-entering function, right? And these often get skipped by these auditors just because of limited time.
Makes sense. And Khani, there are other limitations kind of beyond the I guess other issues beyond the smart contract code itself. What are some of the other pieces that exist outside of smart contract code that auditors typically aren't looking at that everyone really does need to be looking at?
Yeah, so I think the common occurrence is a team says, okay, I'm deploying on chain, and thus I only need to think about my smart contract security when it comes to security. Where the reality is, whenever you're building anything, you need to think about a full life cycle security stack, and what does that look like? And when it comes to something interfacing with the on-chain environment, you also have the off-chain components, the offset components, and those are often overlooked. Take the Bybit hack, for example. It gave crypto a bad name, but it had nothing to do with crypto. It was like a Web2 known attack vector. So really thinking like, okay, this is an addition to my security stack, an addition to what I need to think about. And by the way, huge addition because it contains money. There's a lot more ramification, but it's not the only component. And thinking like the auditors are a piece and they can address, you know, this component of my stack, but there's other places where attackers can enter, where they can understand things about my system, where they can see me as a vulnerable entity, me being the code, and find all the places that I'm weakest and exploit them. And you as a CEO, as a CTO, as the owner of the code, as the dev lead, whatever it may be, need to think that way too. If I was an offensive or an adversarial actor, what would I do? What would I be looking at? And what pieces of my stack could potentially be vulnerable or make myself weak and allow someone in? Because it's this thing, once you allow them through the door, they can find the key usually. So how can they get through the door? And like, again, maybe the smart contract is the safe and the key's in the safe. And like, so the safe has to be extra good. But my God, if you can get in the door and you can see the safe, sometimes you can get into the safe. So you want to make sure they can't get in the door in the first place.
Absolutely. I want to dive more into the limits of an audit scope. So we had mentioned, obviously, there's time, there's human capabilities, there's the understanding of the code, there's the actual what's included in the scope of an audit. Talk to me about what audit scopes typically look like and why audit scopes exist in the first place. Like what limitations are we putting on a typical external audit and why?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. So I think when we're thinking about audits and the way that they're conducted, they are very much put into a box. What do I mean by that? There's a scope of what you are looking at and what's within that audit. And humans can only operate that way. If they don't know where to look, they won't be like, have a focused mission, be able to accomplish something. So they're always given like, okay, go in this direction and find whatever you can in this direction. So when you're pointing them in that direction, there's still a whole world out there that they could look at, but that they're not. That's not part of what they're responsible for. So again, like an auditor can do an amazing job, but something that isn't within their scope can be missed. And that's not faulted on them. That's faulted on you, the company, the CEO, whoever's in charge, right? So really thinking about like these guardrails and boundaries help them be successful, but you need to remember that in the domain that they're supposed to be successful for. So if you think of it like, okay, this is a city, they're just looking on, a few blocks, and you gave them those guardrails, those boundaries, that scope. And aside from that, it's not their problem. And I hate to say it that way, but in the reality is it's your problem, the rest of the city, the rest of the space. And so really thinking about that is important and critical as you're building on chain.
Absolutely. And Anish, what are some of the other kind of limits to scope and how do they impact the effectiveness of an audit?
Sure. I mean, well, the obvious one is money, right? These audits require money. These are services. Essentially, these are people looking through your code. They spend time here and they require money to operate. And you only have a limited amount of money at any point, right, to spend on your contracts. And that often is the limiting factor for a lot of companies and how much time they're spending in audits, how many resources they're spending, etc. So costs often ends up being a very huge determinant in what number of contracts, etc. you're looking at, because a lot of these audit firms charge per line or per contract. The other piece is time. You again have a limited amount of time since before you have to deploy your deployed code, and often that boundary between writing the code and having to deploy it is very short, because every month this code is not being deployed, you're losing money as a company because these contracts are not earning money, right? So the time factor often plays a lot of weightage here as well. Now, how can these be mitigated? This is where tools come in, I think. A lot of these problems that occur with scope can be very easily mitigated by SaaS tooling, since these tools can run infinitely at fixed cost, which are usually time bound and not per run. What you can do is you can just keep running these tools on every commit, on every developer's computers, etc. And these tools will always run in predictable amounts of money, which is usually much cheaper than these auditors anyway.
Absolutely. And that's another thing that we'll expand on in a future episode or part of this first episode. But to round out episode 1, part 1, I want to just talk about the sort of ceiling of audit effectiveness, knowing all of the things that we've gone through today so far on what they're great at and what they're not so great at, and sort of, what that limit is or that ceiling is without complementary security layers. So audits have limitations. A bunch of them are known. We've walked through them, examples of what those things are today, but some of the limitations are unknown, because if the vulnerabilities are unknown and they exist outside of the scope of the audit, you don't even know what you don't know. And I think that's just an inherent truth about security on the whole, which is why we need security to be this layered approach, that Swiss cheese model, because you cannot rely on one single source, knowing that that single source is limited and knowing all of the unknowns that sit around that single source. So each additional layer of security increases the effectiveness of the whole. It's that whole, the sum is greater than its or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So each additional layer, whether that's, you couldn't just do tooling, you shouldn't just do audits, you shouldn't just do on-chain monitoring, but each of these things is made more effective by working in conjunction, because you are surfacing additional unknowns as you look at the results of certain tools or certain audits, and that enables the other tools or the other audits to seek to rectify those issues that are being surfaced. So I think that's my biggest overall take here is just like you don't know what you don't know, and so why not equip yourself with every single tool that could at least give you a glimpse into what those potential unknowns are. But we also know that unfortunately, this isn't yet a completely. It's becoming like a broader and broader opinion that there needs to be a layered approach, but there are still a ton of organizations out there that feel pretty confident in just the audit alone. Hani, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the audit, I mean, I'll say this time and time again, the audit alone creates a false sense of security. And I think an auditor would say the same thing. One audit does not guarantee your security posture is fabulous at all. It means you looked at it. It means you had a third party look at it. It does not mean you did everything you could. And doing everything you could entails an entire stack at your fingertips, proactive, reactive security measures in place. It requires so much more than a manual audit. And of course, a manual audit is critical and you should get the best auditors, of course. But like we look at Euler with 10 external auditors still getting hacked would have been prevented by tools. I mean, I could go on and on with examples like this. When you are not layering your security, you are undermining your team, you're undermining your investors, you're undermining your like everyone. And you're undermining yourself by screwing over your project because it just takes one attack vector for your entire company to go under. And the thought that one external person, human, confined to 20 hours, 30 hours, whatever, is 100% going to find that is utterly stupid.
Yeah, it's true. I think this is a perfect opportunity to share something that actually one of our clients said. So we recently hosted a security table dinner in NYC. We asked each of our guests a very specific question based on their experience and their background. And the CTO, co-founder of one of our client companies, Agora, had a fantastic approach on sort of security overall. And I'm paraphrasing, but the essence of what he shared was that he, as a security-minded CTO, wants to layer in security so much that it's almost perceived as ridiculous. He wants to build it into every step of every process. It needs to be there systemically, it needs to be there structurally, it needs to be there culturally. And the reason for that is if they ever, on some off chance, get hacked, he wants to know that it was categorically not because he was negligent. He did every single thing that he could have done within his power to prevent that from happening. And that is how you sleep at night as someone in a position of leadership with millions, if not hundreds of millions of user funds moving through your protocol in what we know is a pretty hack prone environment today. So that's one thing I think we can take away from that company, and yeah, hopefully we see that continue to proliferate through the space. Audits are limited. There needs to be a layered approach.